So next up, our online speaker is Linda Schott. She's an assistant professor and extension specialist with University of Idaho, and she could not be here with us today in person, but she is here online. So Molly is working on getting that up.
Good afternoon. Sorry, that took me a couple of minutes to get my microphone unmuted. Can everyone hear me?
Linda, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I don't think we can hear Linda though. Okay. Linda, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
We can hear you now. Perfect. Go for it. It's all you.
Awesome. Okay, so like the introduction, I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist with the University of Idaho. I'm based in Southern Idaho, which is a major potato growing region. And I was just asked to give some insight into some management practices that our producers have been adopting. And this is just in my experience, kind of working in the area of soil health. So I do want to give a little bit of context. So I'm located in the Magic Valley, although my position is technically statewide, Southern Idaho. I'm mainly do my work in the Magic Valley region, which is this 8-county region that's highlighted in green here. It is a high desert ecosystem. We only get about 10 inches of precipitation a year, and the majority of that is in the fall, winter timeframe. We don't get significant snowfall, but we do get a decent amount in, the proportion of our total precip. The region itself accounts for 16% of Idaho farms, but 50% of the farm gate receipts. So it's highly productive. And because of this specific region, the Magic Valley, Idaho ranks number 3 for dairy, 1 for potato, first for alfalfa hay, second for sugar beet production, 7th for corn silage, and 5th for dry beans, and that's nationally. And the reason they call it the Magic Valley, in case you don't know, is our natural ecosystem is what you see in this image here, where it's this sagebrush steppe. And when you add a little bit of irrigation water, it magically turns to lush farm ground. And when I say highly productive, just to give some context also for our soils, because I think it's really important to mention this, is our natural organic matter is 1.5%. So if you're in that sagebrush ecosystem of dry land, non-ag production, kind of our natural ecosystem, it's 1.5%. And when you start irrigating the ground, your microbes are actually able to start sequestering and building carbon in the system. And, at best, a really high organic matter in this area is 3%, but a lot of our farm ground is somewhere between 2 and 2.5%. So pretty low organic matter content, and we also have really high calcium carbonates. It's a really tough soil to farm in general, but with irrigation water, we're able to do it. Okay, I'm going to do a small side step. This is not actually a data-driven project, but I think that this project that I did gives good insight into some of the management practices that we're seeing and adds a little bit more context. So I had this project where we looked at active carbon as a soil health metric. So when I came and started my position, I came from the Midwest, the land of soil health and metrics. And I came in and thought I was going to do all of this testing and, make a name for myself with these protocols. And what I have found is a lot of the soil health metrics that are used in the Midwest are not sensitive to management practices in this area in the Magic Valley because our soil type and our cropping system is so different than what you see in the Midwest. I did this project for active carbon with the sugar beet company amalgamated to soil sample acres. And so I was able to get a lot of soil samples, and that's in the next slide. But I'm going to present a little bit of this data for context, so I just wanted to introduce it. So active carbon is also known as POC for manganate oxidizable carbon. It's thought that it's readily degradable by microorganisms. As a side note, there is some discussion amongst researchers right now about what this metric actually means. And I'm mainly presenting on it because we did find sensitivity to it. And like I said, we found that it was sensitive to management practices, which is why I'm going to briefly present this data throughout this presentation. So we sampled 269 fields in the Magic Valley in 2021 and 2022 under a really wide range of management practices. We had different tillage, compost and manure application, cover cropping, a lot of different previous crops. So all of these fields were soil sampled when they were going into sugar beets as part of the rotation. So I am going to represent the potato fields. Actually, I pulled out the data for this. You analyze these soil samples for the color reflectance, and the darker the color, the less active carbon. So it's kind of the opposite of what your brain thinks. Of those 269 soil samples that we have for those 2 years, about 25% of them, 65, were after potatoes. So that's the data I'm going to show just to give context. Realistically, the majority of these producers, 75% of those that grow sugar beets, are also growing potatoes. So I could have shown all the data, but it just gets really messy, and I just thought it'd be easier to show these metrics directly after potatoes as they're going into sugar beets. The great thing about the reason that I did this project with Amalgamated is they soil sample every single acre that's going into sugar beets every year. So first, Idaho has a really robust crop rotation in this region because we have root crops. We have 3 to 5 year crop rotations, typically barley, wheat, sugar beets, corn silage, and alfalfa. And it really depends on where your contracts are and whether or not you're close to a dairy that needs corn silage or alfalfa for their cows. Data that we've seen from Idaho for a soil health in potatoes project that was across multiple states has shown that disease pressure and soil health indicators improved with a 3-year potato rotation versus a 2-year. So, and we really don't have that many producers that are doing 2-year rotations because we have all these other cash crops that are highly profitable. This is that POC data I was telling you about. What was really interesting is that you can see the potatoes there, but we didn't see a difference in active carbon following potatoes, so following a root crop versus following a grain, bean, or corn, which I think is really important because a lot of our producers say that they don't want to do soil health practices because they grow root crops like potatoes and sugar beets, and what's the point? Because harvesting them is basically an act of tillage. So reduction of tillage is another practice that is starting to be adopted by our producers. So some examples are only one pass before potato planting. So we have producers that are direct seeding their sugar beets directly after potatoes. They're not doing any sort of tillage after that, which is very interesting because you hear a lot about how rough those fields are. And I mean, these producers that are direct seeding, they agree that those fields are rough, but they're still able to, they value the reduction of tillage so much that they're willing to do that. There are producers that are direct seeding or no-till planting all of their other crops, small grains and sugar beets, corn, whatever else that they're growing. They are not doing tillage and just having that tillage ahead of potato planting. And then there's also adoption of strip tillage here. There was a lot of research done by the sugar beet industry of how the reduction of tillage and strip tilling specifically improved sugar beet yields because you had less replant. Sugar beets are just really sensitive to wind erosion. And so this is that active carbon POC data again. And in that data, we saw that POC or active carbon was increased under reduced tillage, which is a good thing. And reduced tillage here meant either direct seeding or just in general, they are reducing their tillage in general across their rotation. It may not be right before the sugar beets per se. And you can see that of that subsample of 65, 40 were doing what considered conventional tillage, but 25 were doing reduced. So there is adoption of that. For cover crop integration, cover crops are relatively popular here with some caveats. It's a more popular adoption than reduction of tillage. There is an opportunity after barley, wheat to plant some mixed species cover crops. That's if producers are going to use a cover crop, that's when they're going to do it. Some producers are trying intercropping on their potatoes, or they're flying on some seed prior to harvest. And then when they harvest, that seed kind of gets mixed in and finding success. The problem in this area is even though we're south and we have a relatively long growing season, our days get really short and we lose heat units pretty quickly when you get into August. So if you're trying to plant a cover crop after Labor Day, you're not going to be very successful. So when you're harvesting for stored potatoes and not fresh packed, so processed potatoes, there's not really an opportunity to plant a cover crop. And so they're looking for ways to get that cover crop on earlier if it is going to follow potatoes, or the opportunity would be prior to potatoes after their small grains. Producers here do need to be really careful with their species. Idaho cannot have any beans, so no faba or soybeans as cover crops because of our dry bean production. It's illegal to have that. Producers are also very wary of rye because of the triticale barley and wheat that's grown for malting and other for the commodity. Our producers here also are very careful with vetch and radishes because sometimes they overwinter and you end up with a wreck of vetch that cannot be controlled. Or there was actually a producer this year who had a beautiful cover crop of radish, and some of the seed did not germinate in the fall, overwintered, and then they had to pick out these giant daikon radishes from their processing line as the potatoes came through. Manure and compost application, we have a lot of it available. There is that 180-day rule for applying before potatoes, which you can see in this graph for that POC data, that there just wasn't a lot of manure applied right before potatoes. Our producers and fieldmen are concerned about nitrogen mineralization timing, though, with applying manure compost ahead of potatoes. And some work by USDA ARS here showed that if you're applying very high rates of compost every single year, you can reduce your specific gravity of the potato because you have more nitrogen mineralization happening late in the season. But they're very high rates, and our potato producers that are not associated with dairies are not actually applying these high rates. Lower rates, agronomic rates are appropriate and fine. And we did see a slight increase in POC when you apply manure and compost in that larger data set. And I just wanted to walk through one specific example about a producer here. He's done a lot of field days and a lot of education around his whole crop rotation. He has a 2,500 acre farm, 15 to 20% are in potatoes every year. He has a 6,000 head feedlot. So this is a pretty big operation. So that is, important to keep in mind. This is a large operation. He grows barley and wheat, sugar beets, potatoes, alfalfa, and corn silage because he has that mixed livestock and cropping system farm. He interseeds clover with potatoes. That's something that he's tried to do. He's starting to do. So he's increased his row spacing and planted some clover to see if he can get some nitrogen to into the potato itself. He only tills one time before potatoes. He plants directly into alfalfa and then sprays it out for his other crops. He's got the system down where he's only doing one pass about every somewhere between 4 to 10 years, depending on if alfalfa is in the system. He direct seeds all of his sugar beets and he uses nurse crops, or he'll strip till into the cover crop. And because of all of those practices, he has reduced his nitrogen applications by 20%. He also does a lot of petiole and soil sampling and uses those and fixing cover crops. And then he has a lot of access to compost and manure because of that feedlot that he has. And for the last 12 years, he has not used any fumigation or anything with aside. I guess that's a caveat. About 15% of his acres do get some sort of fumigation or fungicide, but it's a year by year basis decision. But in general, he's reduced those applications because he's increased resiliency. In general, producers are not going to adopt practices that decrease their net returns, increase their their irrigation requirements because irrigation water is limited and expensive. They don't want to adopt practices that are going to increase their fertilizer requirements, which is kind of tricky for cover crops because a lot of our producers are treating their cover crops like it's a secondary crop. They're adding a lot of fertilizer and water to them rather than letting them scavenge. But they don't seem to mind if it's going to be more work, you need more education, or increase their soil testing. With that, I can take any questions or comments.
We have time for one question. Okay, so there was an online question and it was, what soil health indicators are good for soils in the Pacific Northwest?
That's a good question. I can't say that we found, I think that there's a lot of promise with ACE protein, potentially epoxy, although I've got some data that's kind of mixed, even though I just presented on it. But I think there's some potential for ACE protein. I think it just really depends on the individual cropping system that you're in the micro region that you're in the PNW.
Yeah, for sure. All right, thank you. Okay. And then last up for this session, before we release you to pesticide credits, is Gabe LaHoo we introduced earlier, so I'm sure you know all about him. But if you weren't here, he's an assistant professor in the Crop and Soil Science Department with Washington State University.
Okay, yeah, 1 second.